40 meters below the surface of the water, you press your palm flat against the hull. Hold it there. Don't pull it back yet. Feel what happens in the first 5 seconds. The cold moves through your skin and into the bones of your hand in a way that is not unpleasant, but is deeply unfamiliar. Because this is not the cold of climate control or stone floors or metal objects left in shadow. This is the cold of steel that has been in contact with the deep ocean for decades, absorbing it, conducting it, becoming over time a kind of extension of the water itself. The temperature outside this hull, at this depth, has not changed since the last time this vessel was operational. It was cold then. It is cold now. And the steel, patient and indifferent, carries that information directly into your palm as though offering a greeting from something very large and very old. There is no wind here. You already knew that, obviously. You are 40 meters underwater inside a sealed metal tube. But knowing it and experiencing it are two entirely different things. Because the absence of wind is only the beginning. There is no traffic. There are no voices from adjacent rooms. No footsteps in the corridor above you. No distant hum of an elevator. No vibration from a kitchen somewhere below your floor. All the ambient noise that fills every single space you have ever occupied on land, the continuous, overlapping, entirely unconscious background texture of human civilization, is gone. Replaced by something you were not expecting. A sound that comes from everywhere at once. Low, continuous, slightly shifting. Resonant in a way that bypasses your ears entirely and seems to arrive instead somewhere in your chest. The water moving against the hull, the pressure systems cycling, the structure of the vessel settling into the weight it was built to carry. It is not silence. It is the opposite of silence in a direction that silence never warned you existed. This is a hotel. Someone took this vessel, decommissioned, rusting, listed for demolition, and chose, instead of the obvious ending, to imagine something else entirely. It took years. The structural engineers alone required 18 months to confirm the hull was sound enough to be pressurized, inhabited, and operated at depth on a permanent basis. The interior was stripped entirely, down to bare steel, before any reconstruction began. The original equipment, launch mechanisms, operational systems, crew bunks welded directly into the frame of the vessel, was removed piece by piece, cataloged, and either donated to naval museums or stored in crates that still sit in a warehouse somewhere. And then, where all of that had been, someone installed a bed wide enough for 2 people, a rainfall shower, ambient lighting that shifts from cool blue to warm amber over the course of an evening, and a porthole that looks directly into open, dark water. The torpedo room is now the most booked suite in the building. There is a waiting list. What does it feel like to sleep inside a weapon? What does the ocean actually sound like when there are only a few centimeters of curved steel between you and the full weight of water pressing in from every direction? What happens to your sense of time when you remove sunlight, connectivity, and the ambient noise of the world completely and replace them with depth, steel, and the low continuous resonance of open water? What does your body do when it understands, on some level below conscious, thought that it is far underwater in a machine built not for comfort, but for disappearance? These are not dramatic questions. They are practical ones, and every single one of them has an answer. The answer is not what you expect, and it sounds, all of it, completely different from 40 meters below the surface. The hatch closes with a sound that is nothing like a door. It is mechanical. It is heavy. It is the sound of something engineered to be final. A seal engaging with the kind of precision that was designed not for comfort or convenience, but for survival. Because in the context in which this mechanism was built, the difference between a properly sealed hatch and a poorly sealed one was the difference between continuing to exist and not continuing to exist. The sound it makes is solid and weighted and complete. And when it is done, when the last component of the seal has engaged and the system has confirmed pressure integrity, the world above stops, not fades, stops. One acoustic reality ends and another one begins, and the transition is immediate enough that your body registers it before your mind has processed what happened. The first thing you notice in the corridor is how narrow it is, and how the narrowness is entirely different from the narrowness of, say, a a small apartment or an economy aircraft cabin, or any of the other cramped spaces that the modern world occasionally requires you to move through. Those spaces feel small because they were designed for a different scale and then compressed. This corridor feels small because it was designed exactly this large, for exactly this purpose, and not a single centimeter was wasted in any direction. The pipes running along the ceiling and upper walls are original. Hydraulic lines, pressure conduits, electrical runs that once powered the operational systems of an active military vessel. They have been cleaned, and the lighting technicians have positioned small fixtures below them so they are lit from underneath with cool blue light, and they run the full length of the corridor. And moving beneath them feels like moving through something that is not quite architectural and not quite biological, but somewhere in between. Like the interior of something alive that has been very still for a very long time. Touch the wall. Press the flat of your hand against it and hold it there the same way you held it against the hull when you first arrived, and pay attention to what the surface tells you. The texture is not smooth. It is riveted and paneled and slightly irregular in the way that steel construction from this era always is, welded by hand in sections, assembled under pressure and constraint, built to function rather than to please. There is a coating over the original steel, a matte sealant applied during the renovation to prevent oxidation and create a paintable surface. But beneath it, the steel has a grain, a personality, a record of the forces that shaped it and the decades it spent doing what it was made to do. Close your eyes. The hum you noticed when the hatch sealed is still there. It has not stopped. It will not stop for the entire duration of your stay. It comes from the hull, from the water pressing against the outside of the hull, from the mechanical systems that maintain pressure and temperature and air quality, from the vessel itself doing the continuous quiet work of being sealed and submerged and holding. If you press your ear against the wall, the hum changes, becomes lower, rounder, more resonant, more specifically itself. This is what the ocean sounds like from inside the thing that is keeping you from it. And this specific, unreplicable acoustic environment is what people mean when they use the word ASMR in relation to this place, though no one who coined that term had anything remotely like this in mind when they did. The sound design of this vessel was not created by a sound designer. It was not composed or curated or engineered for effect. It is simply the result of physics, water pressure, steel resonance, mechanical systems, acoustic properties of enclosed metal at depth, and it works on the human nervous system in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. It is calming. Deeply, strangely, almost chemically calming. Your shoulders descend. Your jaw unclenches. Your breathing, without you deciding to change it, slows. Something in your body has decided, apparently without consulting you, that this is a safe place. That whatever is making this sound is not a threat. That the right response to being 40 meters underwater in a metal tube surrounded by open ocean is, somehow, rest. There are 8 suites inside the converted hull, arranged along the length of the vessel from forward to aft, each one occupying a space that was previously dedicated to a specific operational function. The design philosophy of the renovation, as articulated in the original architectural brief, which is available to guests who ask, was not to disguise the vessel's origins or to impose a conventional hotel aesthetic onto an unconventional structure, but to work with what was there, to keep what could be kept, to reveal what had been hidden by operational necessity, to let the history of the space be part of the experience of the space, rather than something that had to be overcome or apologized for. The forward suite, the one in the torpedo room, is the result of this philosophy taken to its most complete expression. The space where warheads once waited in launch-ready position, serviced by a crew of specialists who understood them with the kind of intimate mechanical knowledge that only comes from working with something dangerous every single day, now holds a circular bed positioned at the exact center of the room, oriented to face the 4 portholes installed in the forward hull. The portholes are retrofitted. They were not part of the original design, which had no reason to include any windows, because submarines are not meant to see the water they move through, only to be hidden by it. But they were installed with the same engineering rigor that governs everything else about the structure, sealed with tempered glass rated to withstand the pressure at this depth across a margin of safety that exceeds the structural tolerance of the hull itself. At night, with the interior lighting completely off, the glass faces open water, And what comes through it during certain seasons, during certain hours, is bioluminescent plankton. Microscopic organisms producing their own cold light in slow, drifting, completely autonomous patterns. No screen, no projection, no designed effect, just the ocean, doing something it has done for hundreds of millions of years, visible now through a porthole in what used to be a weapons room. The dining area sits amidships, in what was the officers' mess. The room where the senior crew took their meals, held their briefings, made the decisions that determined what the vessel did and where it went, and when it came back up. The original table has been restored rather than replaced. It is solid steel. It is bolted to the floor because at sea, everything that is not fastened down becomes a hazard, and it is slightly too large for the room in a way that was clearly intentional during the original design. A table this size, in a room this size, forces proximity, forces the kind of shoulder-to-shoulder physical closeness that long deployments require you to accept and eventually stop noticing. The chairs are new, low, upholstered in deep navy fabric, the one significant concession to conventional hotel comfort in the entire space. But the original pressure gauges on the walls have been left intact, cleaned and lit, still functional, still reading the depth outside. The same number every meal, 43 meters. The chef works in a kitchen the footprint of a generous walk-in wardrobe. The kitchen is original in dimensions. A submarine galley was designed to be exactly large enough to feed a crew of 40 on a rotation basis, which required radical efficiency and zero waste, and a kind of creative pragmatism with limited ingredients that professional kitchens on land rarely have reason to develop. What arrives at the table from that kitchen does not correspond to the space that produced it. It corresponds somehow to the silence and the depth and the specific kind of attention that this environment generates in people who spend more than a few hours inside it. The control room has been preserved almost entirely intact, and it is the room that most guests spend the most unscheduled time in. Not the suite, not the dining area, but this room, standing where the captain stood, hands resting on the original helm, looking through the periscope at whatever the ocean above is doing. The periscope works. The magnification is adjustable. You can find the surface if you angle it correctly and watch the light filtering down through the water column, shifting, rippling, growing thinner and bluer and more diffuse as it descends until it reaches a depth where it becomes something more like a memory of light than light itself. You can find fish, schools of them, moving in the synchronized formations that look through a periscope lens, like a single organism rather than thousands of separate ones. You can find the shadow of the submarine's own hull above you, reflected back from suspended particles of sediment that drift upward in slow spirals. You can find nothing. Stretches of open water in every direction, dark and clear and completely empty of everything except depth. The navigation instruments surrounding the helm, depth gauges, heading indicators, chronometers, systems for reading the current and the temperature gradient of the water column, have been cleaned and calibrated. They were built to last. They are still working. There is something in this room, in the combination of the functional instrumentation and the operational helm and the view through the periscope, that is harder to articulate than any of the physical sensations the vessel produces. It is something closer to gravity than to atmosphere. The room knows what it is for. It has not forgotten. But the steel carries history that renovation cannot dissolve, and the history is not the history that most people arrive here expecting. There is a version of the submarine that lives in popular culture, in the films and novels and games and television series that have used these vessels as settings for about a century now. And it is, broadly speaking, a romantic version. It involves courage and solidarity, and technical mastery, and narrow escapes, and the particular drama of men operating complex machinery under extreme pressure toward a clear objective. All of those things existed in actual submarine service. None of them were the dominant experience. The dominant experience of serving aboard a submarine during the mid-20th century, the era from which most of the vessels now being converted and preserved and occasionally repurposed into hotels were drawn, was something considerably less cinematic. It was the experience of being confined, without natural light, without fresh air, without privacy of any kind, without the ability to leave, for periods of time that stretched from 60 to 90 days on a single deployment. It was the experience of sleeping in a bunk not much wider than your shoulders, shared in rotation with 1 or 2 other men who used it in the shifts when you were on duty, so that the sheets never fully cooled and the space always smelled of whoever had been there before you. It was the experience of breathing air that had been breathed before, recycled through mechanical scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide and replenished oxygen, but could not remove the smell of 40 men living in close quarters with no ventilation and no ability to open a window, ever, for 3 months. The food was rationed and largely preserved, because fresh food did not last at sea and could not be replenished during a submerged patrol. The fresh produce brought aboard at departure was consumed in the first week. After that, the meals came from cans and from dry stores, prepared in a kitchen the size of the one now producing tasting menus for hotel guests, by a cook who was not a chef, who had been trained in naval galley operations rather than in cuisine, working with ingredients and tools and constraints that would be unrecognizable to any professional kitchen on land. The men ate what they were given. They ate it in the same room, at the same table, on the same rotation, for the duration of the patrol. They did not complain about this, at least not in any documentation that survives. This was the job. This was what submarines were. The psychological record of what this did to people is incomplete, because the institutions involved, military organizations, in all the navies of all the relevant nations, across the relevant decades, did not yet have either the language or the inclination to document the interior experience of their personnel. Mental health was not a framework that existed in operational military culture in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s in any meaningful applied sense. What we have instead are the things that came out later. Memoirs written decades after service, oral histories collected by naval historians in the 1980s and 90s, occasional declassified medical records that were maintained for reasons unrelated to psychological welfare, and reveal psychological states accidentally in the margins. What those sources show, consistently across multiple navies and multiple eras, is a picture of cumulative strain that was managed rather than resolved. The anxiety that arrived 6 weeks into a patrol and did not leave, the sleep disruption that became normalized and then became invisible, the particular form of social pressure that results from having no space away from the people you work with, ever, for months at a time, and having to maintain the kind of functional relationship with those people on which your survival literally depends. And yet, the men who served in these vessels did not, in their memoirs, describe their submarines with bitterness or resentment. They described them with something closer to love. Not always that word. Military writing tends to avoid that word. But with the kind of detailed, specific sensory recall that signals deep attachment. The exact sound of the engines at a particular throttle setting, the precise quality of the light in the control room at a particular hour of a patrol, the smell of the forward torpedo room after a long dive, the way the hull responded to depth changes, the feeling of ascending after weeks submerged, the sound of the hatch opening and the smell, and temperature of open air arriving for the first time in 2 months. These men knew their submarines the way you know a place you have lived through something in. The renovation that created the hotel you are now sleeping in stripped those specifics out of the vessel, removed the bunks, the operational systems, the evidence of the life that was lived here, and replaced them with comfort and atmosphere and a version of the vessel designed for people who will be here for 2 nights and will never know what it was to be here for 60. Some of what was removed went to museums. Some of it is simply gone. Whether that is preservation or erasure is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. And the discomfort of it is more honest, probably, than any answer would be. You surface on the second morning, and the light arrives before you are ready for it. The hatch opens, and what comes in first is the smell, salt and open air and something biological and marine that you cannot identify and do not need to, because your body identifies it immediately and responds to it immediately before you have fully processed the return to the surface world. Then the light. Not the blue-shifted ambient light of the submarine interior, not the warm amber of the suite lighting, but actual sunlight, real, broad-spectrum, full-intensity sunlight, arriving all at once through the open hatch and landing on your face with a physical warmth that you had forgotten was possible. Then the wind. Then the sound of waves, actual surface waves, with mass and direction and weather behind them, not the contained resonance of water pressing against steel from the outside, but the open, moving, variable, uncontrollable sound of the ocean in its own element, doing what it wants, on its own schedule. Your body recalibrates. The horizon is very wide. The sky has more going on in it than you remembered. The surface world, after 36 hours below, presents itself as somewhat excessive, a great deal of stimulus, arriving from many directions, all at once, with no obvious hierarchy or organizing principle. This is the re-entry. It has a name. Submariners called it different things in different navies, and naval psychologists who studied it in the decades after the Cold War called it decompression in the non-physical sense. And it is real, and it lasts for longer than the altitude of the experience would suggest. Something about the sensory environment of the deep changes your calibration to the surface, not permanently, not dramatically, but the change is real and measurable in the days following return. A heightened sensitivity to ambient noise, a preference for quieter spaces, a tendency to notice things that were always there, but had previously been invisible under the accumulated noise of a life conducted entirely above water. The notifications on your phone when you turn it back on feel like they belong to someone else's life. Urgent in a register that no longer fully maps onto what urgency felt like 40 meters below. The meetings, the obligations, the texture of ordinary days, none of it has changed. But your relationship to it has shifted, slightly, in the way that perspective shifts when you have briefly occupied a position very different from your usual one. The submariners knew this too. They knew it better because their version lasted months rather than days and had no luxury accommodation involved. They came up from deployments and had to relearn the surface in ways that no one had a program for, that families struggled to understand, that the men themselves often could not articulate because the language for it, the psychological vocabulary, did not yet exist in the culture they were returning to. What some of them eventually wrote, years or decades later, was that the submarine had given them something they could not get back once they left it. A clarity of purpose, a simplicity of context, a world in which what mattered was immediately obvious, because everything that did not matter had been removed by the simple fact of being sealed inside a hull at depth with 30 other people and a clear set of objectives. The surface after that was genuinely complicated in a way that the deep water never was. The steel of this vessel remembers all of that. It remembers the patrols and the crews and the operational decades and the specific kind of silence that a military submarine maintains when it is running deep and quiet and trying not to be found. None of that memory was removed by the renovation. It lives in the material itself, in the rivets and the hull curvature, and the weight of the original fittings and the hum that the structure makes when the water presses against it at depth, which is the same hum it always made, which is the hum you carried with you when you ascended, and which you will find yourself listening for in quiet rooms for some time after you return. What does it feel like to sleep inside something built to disappear? Leave a comment below, because everyone who comes back up seems to have a slightly different answer, and every single one of them is worth hearing.